Roman numeral 3, the American Revolution. So in the past two lectures, what we did in this unit is we looked at the causes of the American Revolution and the French and Indian War. Today we're going to look at the revolution itself. And what we see here in this opening slide is colonists enthusiastically tearing down a statue of King George III, one, to tear down the statue and show their disrespect, but two, also to get the brass to make cannons of their own, because the colonies didn't have any manufacturing to speak of at this point. So let's begin. So let's start out with reluctant revolutionaries. So the purpose of this section is to talk about the early stages right before the revolution of the colonists coming together as a united group, but also to examine why did it take them so long to declare independence. I mean, at this point, we've already had Lexington and Concord, we've already had the Boston Massacre, there has been a lot of anger and bloodshed spilled already, but it's not going to be for a whole nother year until 1776, where the colonists declare their independence. So that's one of the main questions we're going to be answering in this first section. All right, so the Second Continental Congress meets in 1775. This was, as the name implies, the second time the colonies have gotten together in as many years to talk about what should their response to the British government be. All these taxes and closing down Boston Harbor and all of the tumult that has happened between the two. At this time, though, this is the first time that all 13 colonies come together. So this shows that there's quite a bit of colonial unity, at least at the elite level, to try to figure out, like I said, what to do. However, outside of New England, outside of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, etc., most of the representatives to this meeting from all the other colonies, they do not want independence, they do not want revolution, they still want some reconciliation. They just want to let the king and parliament know that what you guys have been doing so far, you need to stop. And let's go back to being ignored, neglected colonists, and we'll be just fine with the way things were before all of these problems started. So what do? Well, they do what they've been doing for several years now. They continue the non-importation agreements or the boycotts of British goods. That worked to repeal the Stamp Act. And so they're hoping that this will get England's attention again. If we can hit them in the pocketbook, right? If we stop buying British goods, that'll put British merchants and British manufacturers out of business. And maybe they will put pressure on the Parliament to lift some of these onerous taxes. Again, they send petitions to the king and parliament. They say, look, we're loyal subjects, but you really got to stop this stuff. All of these things are going to be ignored by the leaders of parliament and the king. And then they're going to continue to raise up for an army. I shouldn't say raise an army. They're going to continue to squirrel away gunpowder and weapons and those kinds of things, just like the First Continental Congress did, just in case they can't get England to listen to reason, listen to their complaints, and a war breaks out. One more thing before we go on. This Continental Congress is not just going to meet in 1775. They're going to meet all the way on and off until 1781. When a new constitution will go into effect for the colonies. It's called the Articles of Confederation. So throughout most of the war, we have this Second Continental Congress is meeting. They have no power to do anything. The colonies will send representatives to talk about how to maybe do things as a group, but they have no power to levy taxes because it's just a meeting. They have no power to make laws. And so this is going to be a very poor, when the revolution does start, this is going to be a very poor government body to try to get these colonies through a successful revolution. Because like I said, it's just a meeting. It's not an official government. One of the other things that this group does is they send out an olive branch petition. So in July of 1775, as what it says there, it's a last-ditch attempt to please plead with the king to, stop what he is doing, to put on, impress upon Parliament to lay off on the taxes, to get their troops out of the colonies, and to go back to a period of neglect. Now, the king won't even read it. He rejects it. He's like, those colonists, they need to be taught a lesson. Who are these children to tell Mother England what to do? And so it's rejected by the king. The king actually goes beyond rejecting it. He says that these colonies are in a state of rebellion, which is an important kind of legal benchmark, line to cross, is because if the king says you're in a state of rebellion, that means the king has every right to forget your Englishman rights and to arrest you and to then try you and kill you. And so by saying that they're officially in rebellion, this certainly raises the stakes from the British side. Not only that, but the king finally also hires foreign mercenaries. He hires these Germans called Hessians, and he's going to hire them to go and subdue the colonies. And for the colonists, this is certainly troubling, because a king is not supposed to hire foreigners to come and kill and oppress his own people. And this is going to turn a lot of people into the patriot cause when they find out the king does this. And then also the king's navy starts to attack certain colonial settlements along the coast, Norfolk and Falmouth. These are two towns along the coast of the colonies. And the British Navy thought that there were some revolutionaries in these towns, and so they burned down the towns. So the king is actively saying he is going to wage war on the colonists, his own subject. He has hired foreign mercenaries, and he started to burn down towns. And for a lot of people, that's enough. That's the last straw. And so for many of the delegates, before the Olive Branch Petition was rejected, like I said, most of the people in the Continental Congress wanted to, make peace with the king, and they didn't want revolution. But the more the king and parliament try to crack down and control the colonies, the more they push them into the arms of rebellion and the patriots. So let's talk about, well, why still? Why still? After July of 75, the king has done all of these things. Why are the colonists so hesitant and reluctant to declare their independence? So let's look at this. Like if you could go back at the war and who do you predict would win, it certainly wouldn't be the colonies. England has a larger population than the Americans. They have 7.5 million people as opposed to 2.5 million people. And obviously, if you're going to go into a war, you want to have more people than the other person. Next, England has a strong centralized government that can raise taxes, raise an army, make important decisions, coordinate the war effort. The colonies have no national government. They have the Second Continental Congress, but like what I said, even though that's going to be their quote-unquote government during the Revolution, it's just a meeting of men. They have no power to do anything. They have no power to levy taxes. They can try to create an army, but they have no power to supply that army. It's called the Continental Army. And so we see that this is going to be a real problem throughout the Revolution. The colonists, the Continental Army that's led by George Washington, they're going to be begging and pleading for Congress to give them money and food and supplies. And time again, the Second Continental Congress is like, look, we can't force our fellow colonies to support you because we don't have any authority. And so this is going to make the war drag out, and for many times throughout the war, it looks like the colonists are going to lose for this reason. Next, money. This obviously is an advantage for the British government. They have a government that can afford to raise taxes and to borrow money. The colonies have no ability to raise taxes. And it's really hard to borrow money. Like if the Second Continental Congress wants to, let's say they can't raise taxes, so let's say they want to borrow money from banks or other countries like France or Spain or the Netherlands, it's going to be very hard to do that because, you wouldn't loan money to somebody that doesn't have a job because they can't pay it back. And so France and Spain and some of these other European countries, they're very hesitant to loan America money because there's no central government that can raise taxes to pay it off. So eventually they will get some loans, but it's going to be hard going, slow going, and it's not going to be a lot of money that they need. Next, the military. Again, advantage British. The English have a very large navy at this point in history, some of the biggest navy almost in the world and the best trained. Their army is not as big as other countries, but it certainly is well trained, well coordinated, has lots of experience fighting. In addition to that, we're going to add mercenaries that the British have access to, those Hessians. And to make matters worse, about 1/3 or so, 20%, maybe 33%, is hard to say, but a significant number of the colonists themselves will remain loyal to the king. So the Americans are going to be, the patriots are going to be fighting the British with all of these disadvantages, and anywhere from 20 to 33% of their own citizens are going to be loyal to the other side, to the British. On the American side, we have about 1/3, 20% to 1/3 of the colonists who will actively support the war. That is it. The other 1/3 or so is just going to be people who just want to sit the war out. They don't want to join either side. Because if you say no, you're going to get ridiculed. If you say yes, support the revolution, you might lose your land and property. You might get killed for treason. And so it's hard to fight this war with just 1/3 or so of your population. In addition to that, there's never been a united army before of the United States. And so there is this Continental Army that is under the command of George Washington. And these are our best soldiers. These are going to be in the army for a long time. They're going to be trained. They're not going to be well equipped, but they're going to be the best trained. But the bulk of the U.S. Army is going to come from just local colonial militias. These are just farmers that have agreed to sign up, sometimes for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then go back to their farms. They're not well trained, they're not well equipped. And a lot of times in the war, when they go toe-to-toe with the British, at the first sign of trouble, they just run and go back home. And so it's going to be really hard for George Washington to depend on these colonial militia to augment his continental army. So again, all the advantages here are for the English. Next, manufacturing. You have to make gunpowder, you have to make uniforms, you have to make boats, you have to make cannons, you have to make muskets, and the colonies have very little of this. The Navigation Acts, if you remember, forbade the colonies from manufacturing anything substantive, and so we just don't have the industrial base to do it. On the other hand, England can make a lot of these things because England is very in the early stages of her industrial revolution. And so England has lots of artisans, lots of small factories that can start making these things. And so they just have everything. Americans are going to have to beg, borrow, and steal to get gunpowder and cannons and muskets and all the things they need to carry on the war. So again, advantage English. There is one disadvantage for the English is distance. And this is a big disadvantage. Is that England's about 1,000 miles away from the action. And so when England needs to figure out what they should do during the war, obviously their decisions are going to be delayed. Their reinforcements are going to be delayed. And so it's just long supply lines. The colonists themselves, they kind of have home field advantage on many reasons. One, they know the terrain very well, so they know how to pick the best places to put up a fight or a defense. And two, they're fighting to defend their homes. The colonists believed they had liberty on their side. They're fighting for something noble. They're fighting for freedom and their Enlightenment rights. And so that's going to make them fight harder and carry on the fight longer. If you're an English soldier, you're probably in the army because you were impressed, you were forced to be in it, or it was either that or go to jail. And so not a lot of the British regular soldiers really want to be there anyway, and they're not fighting for something noble. And so we see this certainly as an advantage for the Americans. And then we have a quote that kind of just makes it real basic, right? If you were a colonist who were founded in arms, raising opposition against Mother England, this is what we do to people who we consider traitors. And so this same thing happened in Ireland a few years ago, but it's the same idea, right? So if you're a patriot and you're caught as a leader or as a follower in the revolution, this is what a judge would say to you. You are to be hanged by the neck, but not until you are dead, just painful enough to make you almost dead. For while you are still living, your bodies are to be taken down from the noose, your intestines, your bowels torn out and burned before your face. So they're going to cut you open, pull your intestines out and burn it before your face. Your heads then cut off, and your bodies divided into 4 quarters, and nay, the Almighty God have mercy on your souls. This is called being hanged, drawn, and quartered. And this is the fate that awaits you if you join the revolution. So I think you can start to see why people were so reluctant. They don't have very many advantages as Americans, and if they lose and get caught, you have horrible things awaiting you. And so things have to be pretty bad for you to agree to revolution. But for a lot of Americans, we see that we've reached that point, right? The king is just doing too many things and it's worth the risk. All right, so let's go to the next section. It says no turning back. And so in 1775, and as we go into 1776, the leaders of the revolution know that they do have some lower class people on their side. We've talked about the Sons of Liberty. They have some middle class artisans on their side. They certainly have elite merchants on their side, lawyers, newspaper owners, as we've said before. And so how do we get more people to be on the side? How do we convince all of those people just sitting on the sidelines to join the patriot cause? We need some propaganda. And so here we have in the top right-hand corner, we have Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine is going to write a pamphlet called Common Sense. And his audience for this is the common people of the colonies. So he doesn't write, as other colonial leaders do, he doesn't use language that refers to Greek and Roman philosophers. He doesn't talk about these fancy Enlightenment ideas and assume that his reading audience is intellectual and educated. And so he tries to make the case for revolution as plain as possible, something that a shopkeeper, a dock worker, a farmer can understand. And so here are his main points. He says, first of all, In England, the only way to get freedom and advancement and opportunity is to be born into it. It's hereditary, right? In America, we're a different kind of people. We've developed a new culture where it's a meritocracy, where people in America can achieve higher, basically the American dream of become higher in social status and have more money and really make it because we're based on our merit and our hard work and our dedication. And so he says, which country do you want to be a part of? Do you want to be dominated by a meritocracy where it's controlled by people who inherit their power? Or do you want to be in a country where everybody is free to rise up based on their own skill and intellect and hard work? And so if you're an average farmer and a poor farmer, this makes a lot of sense to you. It's very appealing. Next, he says the king has acted like a tyrant, which is a loaded term. That means that he is an evil, bad ruler. He is not some king chosen by God and blessed by God to be your ruler. He's not a representative of God. If you rise up against this king, you're not rising up against God. You're rising up against a man who is just a man, and he has abused his power, and he has killed our fellow citizens. And this is something an average person can understand. He's kind of taking Enlightenment ideas and distilling them down in basic plain language that people can understand. Next, he says, look, who said we have to have a monarchy and a king, right? This is a new age. The Enlightenment says that everybody has natural rights, that everybody has the right to life, liberty, and property. And so the king cannot take away your rights. You are smart enough, you are good enough to run the government yourself. And so he's promoting the idea of democracy. And of course, if you're a middle or lower class person, and Thomas Paine says when this revolution is over, you're going to have more power and more control over your government, your life, that's very appealing to you. Yeah, down with heredity, down with monarchy. Yes, power to the common people. We call this the spirit of 76. This idea, these words of democracy, liberty, freedom, it's resonating up and down the coast, all 13 colonies. And people, as you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, they're getting very excited about this. Common people, they think they now have a stake, right, in this revolution. It's not going to be when a revolution is over, these elite replace these elite. No, when we're done, the masses will have power again, and that's very intoxicating for the lower class people, right? And then he also says that the king is actually in our way. Right? We could be great. This kind of goes back to Ben Franklin and his Albany plan, right? America is the future of the world. If we go back to the Pilgrims, it's the city upon this hill idea, this American exceptionalism, is that you and me, our fellow citizens, all of us Americans, we are something different than England, right? And we could be great, you know. We have the resources, the people, we have the energy, we have a meritocracy, and the king is just the old world holding us back. And so this is kind of appealing to people's egos, and this is like saying we could be great, and everybody wants to be told they're great. And so all of these ideas, these Enlightenment ideas and appealing to people's self-interest, all of this is really going to garner to get the common people on board with the revolution. So we can't understate the importance we can't overstate the importance of just how the impactful common sense is to helping the American Revolution. And then, of course, he ended up with saying, when should we have this revolution? Now, right? Not when our children have to suffer through this, not when our grandchildren have to suffer through this, but this generation has to take a stand, and we have to make sure that our future generations, our progeny, our descendants have the freedom that we purchase. And of course, people have kids. They want to look out for their kids, and they want the revolution now. Excited from Thomas Paine's common sense. So this is one of the most important revolutionary documents. The next one we're going to talk about is, of course, the Declaration of Independence. So the Second Continental Congress, this is probably what they're most famous for doing, is they're sitting around trying to talk about, okay, what should we do? Yes, we think the king is bad, but is it really bad enough for us to declare independence? And throughout the whole summer of 1776, especially New England, they are saying that, look, we've been affected by this, but you're next. And so they're trying to make the case for independence. And I think we've made the statements here that we have now understood that the king, maybe there is no going back. And so all throughout the summer, they start to wear the opposition down, and we see colony after colony start to get in on the side of independence. And so on July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress calls the vote. They've been debating about it all summer. Should we actually have independence? And they vote yes, we should have independence. And so 2 days later, on July 4th, a written piece of paper, a declaration, if you will, to the world is put forth that says these are the reasons of why we're declaring our independence. It was proposed by Richard Henry Lee, this whole vote, should we be independent? It was Virginia. And so they created a committee of 5 to just actually write a piece of paper down called the Declaration of Independence so that the world would know why we're doing this, that we're going to state our Enlightenment rights, that this is an Enlightenment revolution, that we're fighting for freedom and democracy and liberty, and we want the world to know all the bad things the king has done, which is what most of the Declaration of Independence is. It's a list of the misdeeds of the king, and then it also is kind of encapsulating what we believe as a new country. The Committee of 5, we don't have to know all of them, although certainly we could, but the most important ones, we have Thomas Jefferson, who's right here. He wrote most of the Declaration of Independence, and then we have John Adams, right, and then we have Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. But the big 3 of these 3 right here, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, right, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Those are the big 3 that really kind of push it through. All right, and so let's take a little bit closer look at the Declaration itself. Like I said, most of the Declaration is a list of wrong deeds of the king, so that our own citizens and citizens of the world will know that we're not just babies crying for nothing, is that we have valid reasons for doing this. And so let's now read this part of the Declaration. It says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people, the colonists, to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, England, and to assume among the powers of the earth, independence, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. And that whole idea of the laws of nature, this is Enlightenment language, so already you know that these guys are trying to create an Enlightenment document that's about freedom, democracy, liberty, right? A decent respect to the opinions of mankind, the world, requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We want the world to know why we're declaring our independence and our own citizens. So here we go. This is the more famous part. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is all Enlightenment stuff, right? When Thomas Jefferson wrote these words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he is parroting, maybe plagiarizing John Locke, who said that people have the right to life, liberty, and wealth, right, and money. And so, you know, we have our lives that nobody can ruin, can take away, king. We have our freedom, that's liberty, that we were born with. Those are our natural rights, and nobody can deny us of those. And pursuit of happiness, we have the right to pursue our lives however we want, to make money, to move where we want to go. Think of the Proclamation of 1763, and to worship the way we want without anybody telling us what to do. These are indelible American rights that kind of creates our culture today. This is what it means to be American. That to secure these rights, we're reading again, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So here he's saying that the only reason governments are created is to protect people's rights. It's not to make a king rich. It's not to make a few men in parliament rich. Governments are created for the single purpose of protecting people's rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Here's another Enlightenment idea, is that the only way governments have power is if the people let them have the power, by voting people into office. God does not give people kings power. The people give kings power. The people give representatives power, not the other way around, right? And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, taking away your rights, it is the right of the people to alter, which means peacefully try, or to abolish, which if that doesn't work, violently overthrow, and institute a new government. And so this is the basis of American independence and what it means to be American today, right? These are all ideas rooted in the Enlightenment. What is government? What is its purpose? Where does a government get its power? What are the rights that we all have? Where do they come from? All of these things the Enlightenment was seeking to answer. And this is what Thomas Jefferson and his Committee of 5 said to Congress, and what Congress agreed with and issued to the world. And there you go. That is kind of encapsulating what America, they promise, is going to be about. Now, before we go on, let's take a look at this concept of all men are created equal. Because for me, this is really the most important part of this whole course. You know, American history can be viewed with this idea, this promise that is made, that all men are created equal. That's a big promise that we all should be treated equally. Now, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, it meant all white men who were property owning, have a certain amount of wealth, basically middle class and above, and that's it, right? All white men who were fairly wealthy. Now, that's not a lot of people. That's not true democracy. And so, for the rest of American history, I think you can view our course and our country as trying to live up to that promise. Sometimes we have to be dragged to it, sometimes we leap to it. Because eventually all men are created equal, and we get to the age of Jackson, that's going to be all white men, rich or poor. Right? And then as we go on through the course, we're going to get to the Civil War, and that's going to say all white and black men. It doesn't matter your race as long as you're male. And then, of course, we're going to get to the 20th century, and that's going to mean all men and women. And so we're fulfilling that promise, increasing democracy. And then when we get later into the 20th century, it means that that's people who are gay, and that's people who are handicapped. And so we continue to struggle with this idea of who are citizens and what their rights are. And the promise was made there, and it was a narrow promise for just a small segment of the population. But over time, we have tried as a country to increase that promise to more and more people. And I think that's a great way of thinking about this course and American history, is trying to live up to that promise of all men are created equal. All right, so let's talk about our learning objectives now. These are the things that I would take away from this portion of the lecture. It says, describe the considerable advantages the British had over the colonies at the start of the Revolution, and they were considerable. We had that chart, and we talked about how England had more people, more money, more men, a better military, and there were really very few advantages the colonists have, except they were fighting for something noble. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting to protect their families. And it turns out that's enough to get us through the tough times of the war. 2, it says, analyze the actions taken by the Second Continental Congress to both avoid war. That's kind of referring to the Olive Branch Petition. We said that not a lot of colonists wanted to do it, even after the war started, and to prepare for its occurrence. We had talked about the First and Second Continental Congresses starting to squirrel away weapons and get ready for a war, just in case the English don't back off, right? Number 3, it says, analyze the main points Thomas Paine and common sense used to argue for the revolution. We talked about he tried to make it an everyday a document that an everyday man could understand, bring in Enlightenment ideas, but put it in such a way that everybody could understand what those ideas are. And then it says, analyze the main points that Thomas Jefferson used in the Declaration of Independence to argue for the revolution. And we just finished talking about that. Again, an Enlightenment-inspired document to talk about that America is created for all men, and that they're created for rights that cannot be taken away, and where governments get their power. And so this is kind of the philosophical world that the revolution is inhabiting. When we come back, we'll do part 2 of our lecture, and we're going to start with choosing sides.